In Dearborn, Michigan, a quiet street became the center of a shocking story. What started as a seemingly normal life for Grace Obina, a devoted wife and churchgoer, turned into a tale of betrayal and heartbreak. Grace was married to Emmanuel, a hardworking man battling declining health, but their marriage was crumbling. She felt ignored and lonely. Then, a new connection entered her life: Farouk Shakir, her mysterious neighbor. This innocent bond slowly grew into something much bigger and riskier. Their choices would lead to devastating consequences, revealing how quickly lives can unravel when desire overtakes reason. Grace Obina's life wasn't always this complicated. She was once a woman of faith, deeply rooted in her church and her marriage. But as time passed, her home became a place of silence and emptiness. Emmanuel, her husband, was a dedicated man, but his long hours at work and growing health problems left little time or energy for their relationship. Grace felt the weight of loneliness creeping in. Her once lively home now echoed with stillness, and her days became a blur of church errands and quiet evenings. Emmanuel, focused on his work and his health struggles, didn't notice how deeply his wife was slipping into despair. For Grace, the need for connection grew stronger every day, even as she tried to find comfort in prayer and her faith. This was the fragile state of her life when Farouk Shakir, her neighbor, entered the picture. Farouk Shakir had lived across the street for a couple of years, but Grace had never thought much about him until recently. He was a quiet man who kept to himself, often seen tending to his yard or greeting neighbors politely. Farouk, a widower, carried an air of mystery, which made him stand out in their close-knit community. His past was marked by loss. His wife had passed away suddenly, leaving him to rebuild his life alone. He seemed kind, even thoughtful, often bringing over food during holidays or exchanging pleasantries. But beneath his calm demeanor was a man still haunted by grief. Grace found herself noticing him more, drawn to the quiet strength he seemed to carry. At first, it was nothing more than friendly exchanges, but for Grace, those brief moments became a small escape from the emptiness she felt at home. Farouk, too, seemed to linger in their conversations just a little longer than usual, though neither of them could have predicted where it would lead. It wasn't one big moment that brought Grace and Farouk closer. It was a series of small, seemingly innocent encounters. One day at the market, they bumped into each other while shopping for groceries. It started as polite conversation, but something about that exchange lingered with Grace. For the first time in a long while, someone truly noticed her. Over the next few weeks, their paths seemed to cross more often at the pharmacy, near the church, even outside Grace's home. These moments felt unplanned, but they became harder to ignore. For Grace, the loneliness she had carried for so long began to feel a little lighter when Farouk was around. Farouk, too, seemed to find comfort in Grace's presence. Their conversations started to go beyond the surface, sharing small pieces of their lives. It wasn't romantic, at least not yet. But there was something unspoken between them, something they both felt but didn't dare to name. By late March, their connection moved past casual conversations. It started with a simple gesture. Grace noticed Farouk struggling to carry a heavy bag into his house. Without thinking, she crossed the street to help. Inside his home, she caught a glimpse of his life, a modest, well-kept space with traces of his late wife photos on the wall and a prayer mat neatly placed in a corner. Farouk offered her water, and they sat down to talk. For the first time, the air between them felt charged, almost heavy with things left unsaid. A small, fleeting touch, a brush of their hands as he handed her the glass, left Grace's heart racing. She didn't pull away, and neither did he. That moment marked the beginning of something they both knew was wrong, but couldn't resist. It wasn't planned, and it didn't come all at once, but their relationship began to change. Their stolen moments became a secret world that only they shared, hidden from the watchful eyes of their community. As the weeks went on, Grace and Farouk became more deliberate about their meetings. Their connection had grown into something deeper, something neither of them could fully control. Farouk's home turned into their private escape, a place where they could set aside the burdens of their everyday lives. But with every meeting, the weight of what they were doing grew heavier. They both came from deeply religious backgrounds, and guilt was a constant shadow in their moments of passion. Farouk would often retreat into prayer after Grace left, seeking forgiveness for the choices he had made. Grace, too, felt torn, caught between her faith, her obligations as a wife, and this overwhelming pull toward Farouk. Despite the risks, they couldn't stop. Their meetings became an addiction, a dangerous cycle they both knew could unravel everything. And with every passing day, the line between love and obsession began to blur. By early summer, the changes in Grace's behavior were impossible for Emmanuel to ignore. She had become distant, her once warm and cheerful demeanor replaced by a quiet detachment. Emmanuel noticed how she lingered outside after errands, how her phone was always locked, and how her late-night prayers had become less frequent. At first, he dismissed these as small changes, attributing them to her busy schedule or perhaps his own declining health. But soon, the little signs added up. Grace seemed preoccupied, lost in her thoughts, and her laughter, once so familiar, had all but disappeared. Emmanuel's instincts told him something was wrong, but he didn't want to believe it. For years, he had trusted Grace without question, convinced that their bond was strong enough to withstand anything. Now that trust was beginning to crack, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was pulling her away. Unable to ignore the growing doubts, Emmanuel decided to act. One evening in July, when Grace left the house under the pretense of visiting a church member in need, Emmanuel followed her. His heart pounded as he kept a safe distance, watching as she walked through the dimly lit streets. When she turned the corner and approached Farouk's house, his worst fears were confirmed. He froze in place, hidden in the shadows, as he saw her step inside. The door closed behind her, leaving Emmanuel standing there, stunned and shattered. He didn't confront her that night. Instead, he returned home, his mind racing with questions and emotions. When Grace returned, he confronted her directly. His voice trembled with pain and anger as he demanded the truth. Grace broke down under the weight of his questions, her guilt finally spilling out. She confessed to the affair, swearing it was a mistake and pleading for forgiveness. In the days that followed, their home became a battlefield of emotions. Emmanuel was heartbroken, but still wanted to save their marriage. Grace promised to end things with Farouk, and they began counseling, seeking guidance from their pastor. For a brief moment, it seemed as though they might find a way forward. But some promises are easier to make than to keep. As the weeks passed, Emmanuel tried to move past the betrayal, making an effort to be more present in their marriage. His declining health made it harder, but he pushed through, determined to repair what was broken. Grace, too, threw herself into the relationship, wanting to make amends. But the guilt of what she had done never fully left her. She told herself that she would end things with Farouk, but every time they crossed paths, the pull between them grew stronger. What had started as an affair had transformed into something deeper, more consuming. Despite her attempts to sever ties, she couldn't escape the bond they had formed. Emmanuel's health took a turn for the worse. His energy was fading, and his condition became harder to ignore. The stress of caring for him, combined with the unresolved tension between her and Farouk, weighed heavily on Grace. Farouk remained a constant presence in her life, offering an escape from the strain of her reality. The meetings between them had started as a secret, but now they were a lifeline for Grace, one she couldn't let go of, even as the consequences loomed closer. As Emmanuel's condition worsened in the fall of 2013, Grace found herself at a breaking point. His illness had drained him, and caring for him day in and day out left her exhausted and emotionally worn. She tried to hide her frustration, but the constant stress was taking its toll. Then, Farouk's words began to echo in her mind. During one of their meetings, he had suggested something that Grace initially pushed away. He questioned why she should continue to suffer through Emmanuel's deteriorating health when the outcome seemed inevitable. He painted a picture of a life where she could be free to be with him, without the weight of Emmanuel's illness hanging over them. At first, Grace had recoiled at the idea, but as the days went on, his suggestion lingered in her thoughts. Emmanuel's condition was only getting worse. He was no longer the man she had married. He was frail, in pain, and dependent on her. The guilt she felt about her affair mixed with the resentment building up from caring for Emmanuel. By the beginning of December, Grace was torn. The thought of ending Emmanuel's suffering and freeing herself to be with Farouk began to feel like an option. She battled with herself, trying to reconcile her sense of duty with her desperate need for freedom. The idea that once seemed unthinkable was now a possibility she couldn't shake. On the night of December 5, 2013, Grace finally made her choice. The tension in the house was palpable as Emmanuel sat quietly in the living room, his health declining rapidly. Grace, her hands trembling, prepared the evening dose of medication. But this time, there was something different about it. Hidden in the medicine was a vial of poison, provided to her by Farouk. She had wrestled with the decision for weeks, torn between her love for Emmanuel, her guilt, and her desire to be with Farouk. But now, as she stood in the kitchen, the choice was made. Emmanuel was suffering, and the life she dreamed of with Farouk seemed just within reach. After their nightly prayer, Emmanuel went to bed, unaware of what was unfolding. Grace followed, her heart pounding in her chest. She handed him the glass of water with the lethal dose, and he drank it without question, trusting her completely. Within hours, Emmanuel's breathing slowed, and his body grew still. Grace sat by his side, watching him drift into what would be his final sleep. A mix of sorrow, guilt, and a strange sense of resolve washed over her. She had done it. Emmanuel was gone, and the weight of that decision began to settle in. But there was no turning back now. After Emmanuel's death, Grace worked quickly to cover her tracks. She wrapped his lifeless body in a sheet and dragged it out to the backyard, her movements mechanical, almost numb. The night was dark, the neighborhood silent, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and her labored breath. She dug the grave with a sense of urgency, trying to mask the crime she had just committed. Her hands were raw and sore, but she didn't stop. Every shovel full of dirt that fell onto the ground seemed to add weight to the burden she was carrying. She was aware of the risk, but at that moment, it felt like the only way forward. When she was done, she covered the disturbed soil with pots of flowers, hoping to hide any evidence. As dawn approached, Grace returned to her house, her expression calm, as if nothing had changed. The next morning, she told the neighbors that Emmanuel had passed away peacefully in the night, and that his body had been taken to his village for burial, as was their tradition. Her performance was convincing, and most of the community accepted her story without question. But there was one person who didn't buy it, Mrs. Ademi, the elderly widow next door. Mrs. Ademi had seen Grace's frantic movements the night before. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, so she decided to keep a close eye on the situation. Her suspicions would eventually lead to a chain of events that no one could have predicted. As the days passed, Grace maintained her story, but Mrs. Ademi wasn't convinced. The elderly neighbor had noticed the strange activity in Grace's backyard and couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her gut told her to keep watching, so she did. On December 12th, Mrs. Ademi finally decided to act. She contacted the police, sharing her concerns about the unusual behavior she had witnessed. At first, the officers were skeptical. After all, Grace had been a well-respected member of the community, and everything seemed to align with her story. But something about the situation didn't sit right with them, so they decided to investigate further. When the police arrived at the Obina home, Grace greeted them with her usual calm demeanor, insisting that her husband had passed away and been buried in the village. But as they looked around, they noticed something strange. The freshly planted flowers in the backyard and the disturbed soil raised immediate suspicion. The officers obtained a warrant to dig up the area. By December 15th, their suspicions were confirmed. Emmanuel's body was unearthed, still wrapped in the sheet Grace had used. The sight was grim, and an autopsy soon revealed the presence of a deadly toxin in his system, confirming what everyone had feared: Emmanuel had been murdered. When Grace was brought in for questioning, she stuck to her story, denying any involvement in her husband's death. But the evidence was overwhelming. The autopsy results, the disturbed soil in the backyard, and Mrs. Adeyemi's testimony were all stacking up against her. As the interrogation continued, Grace's calm exterior began to crack. She broke down, confessing to the crime, but still trying to deflect responsibility. In her confession, she pointed the finger at Farouk, claiming that he had provided her with the poison and manipulated her into carrying out the plan. The police wasted no time pursuing Farouk. They arrived at his home on December 16th, only to find it abandoned. Inside, they discovered evidence that painted a chilling picture. Text messages between Grace and Farouk discussed Emmanuel's condition and their plans for the future, along with a vial containing traces of the same poison used in Emmanuel's death. It became clear that Farouk had been the mastermind behind the entire scheme. But by the time the authorities realized he was gone, Farouk had vanished without a trace. He had planned his escape well, leaving Grace to face the consequences alone. As the investigation into Farouk's disappearance continued, the case quickly captured the public's attention. Grace's trial began on March 8, 2014, drawing a crowd of spectators, journalists, and curious neighbors eager to see how the shocking story would unfold. The prosecution wasted no time in presenting its case. They painted Grace as a cold, calculating woman who had been driven by greed and lust. They highlighted her affair with Farouk, her role in Emmanuel's death, and her attempts to cover up the crime. The evidence against her seemed irrefutable, especially the autopsy results and the incriminating text messages between her and Farouk. On the other side, Grace's defense team argued that she had been manipulated by Farouk. They portrayed her as a vulnerable woman overwhelmed by her circumstances who had been coerced into committing an unthinkable act. They painted a picture of a woman broken by guilt, trapped by her emotions, and desperate to escape a painful reality. The courtroom became a battleground of emotions, with family members, neighbors, and even church members testifying about Grace's life and character. But despite the defense's efforts, the evidence painted a clear picture of a carefully planned murder.